Hi everyone, welcome to this podcast about information security, and the spotlight today is on the not-for-profit sector. My name is Janine Chasma. I'm a managing consultant with Equantiis. I specialise in our not-for-profit and higher education sectors, and I help our organisations to become more operationally efficient and improve their member and student experience.
Hi, I'm Tanya Sewell. I'm one of the executive consultants at Equantiis. I've worked with quite a few organisations within this sector over the last few years, supporting them with either information security, maturity, or with the general data protection regulations, so the data privacy side. I also work on process improvement and optimization projects as well for our clients, and often the two things can work quite well together hand in hand.
Absolutely. So Tanya, today our podcast is all about information security. So some people call it cybersecurity. You've already mentioned GDPR. That's going to be our spotlight. The first place we really want to start is looking at some stats, right? Because this doesn't happen to the not-for-profit sector, right? This is other organisations having breaches.
Yeah, and that's it, isn't it? And I think from the clients that we've engaged with in the past, this is certainly something that comes up quite frequently, particularly among the smaller charity organisations and smaller membership bodies. Why would anybody be interested in us? Why would anybody want to steal our data or attack us in any way? But I think it's really important actually to remember that hackers and people like that, they're not necessarily targeting somebody specific. Sometimes it's just opportunistic. And also there's the other side of information security breaches, which we know that quite a significant proportion of data breaches are actually caused by employees accidentally within an organisation, and I think that's something that we have definitely seen within this particular sector.
Yeah, I think actually front and centre there, Tanya, the HIV Scotland example is one of those actually, right? That was to do with bulk email practices, which often we find happens in the not-for-profit sector.
Yeah, and I think it's that this was an example of using BCC, or rather not using BCC in this particular case. And yeah, we've seen this happen quite a lot. And when people are relying on manual processes for doing things like bulk emails, it's really, really easy to make a mistake. And we've seen examples of this ourselves. We've also seen examples of where people have just sent some potentially really sensitive information to the wrong people, sometimes external to the organisation. So I think this is a really, really good example of something that happens way more than you would think, and it's far too easy for it to happen. And in this particular case, of course, it involves special category information, which was really serious. And actually, I think HIV Scotland got off quite lightly for considering what you could infer from what happened, really.
Yeah, so basically, just to put it into context, and because I can see this happening in lots of organisations that we work with. So an email went out and they included all of the recipient names, right, in the email, including I think 65, which had where individuals' actual names were in the kind of to part of the email, and of course by implication, then that notifies somebody's HIV status, and therefore, like you say, special category health data being put to the forefront. Yeah, very, very difficult situation. There was a transgender charity called Mermaids who had a similar situation in back in July 21, and this time they were fined £25,000 by the ICO, and that was to do again with emails and an email group being set up, and then those emails became traceable online, and again they had lots of sensitive personal information, including physical health and sexual orientation.
Yeah, you don't get more serious than that, really, do you?
Absolutely.
That's pretty bad. And then you've got these other examples, the Red Cross and Oxfam, and they're different types of breach, really. These are those hackers, those opportunistic attacks, where and charities could also be a target in some cases, some of the larger ones, for actual targeted attack. I know some of them have research and development functions as well, and that puts them out there potentially for attack.
Absolutely. And I think the big headline here, quarter of charities report having cybersecurity breaches or attacks in the last 12 months. So this is a lot more prevalent than perhaps we're hearing. The news is dominated by other stories at the moment. Maybe these stories are not finding their way to the big headlines, but it's happening.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is I do question how many breaches actually get noticed within this sector and reported, and I think one of the ones that you mentioned, the mermaid one, the breach was actually happening since it had been ongoing since I think 2016.
Yeah.
And they hadn't actually noticed it until maybe 3 years later. And they're not alone. The BA, the big, obviously not in this sector, but British Airways, that big breach that happened a few years ago. Again, that was a technical issue that wasn't uncovered until several years later. So it's not just for this sector, but I do think that the bigger corporate sectors have a lot more money to spend on this, so it makes it easier in some respects for them to be more on top of it. And I do question how many breaches actually aren't picked up and just aren't reported within this as well. And I think another thing, Janine, we were talking about this earlier, that's quite interesting here is we noticed that the percentage of charities that say that they report cyber security to their senior management team has actually gone down since 2020, and that's really interesting, isn't it? Why would suddenly, if you were reporting information security on a regular basis and incidents and what you're doing in that area to your senior management team, why would that suddenly go down in the last year? Is that because COVID has sort of taken over and taken dominance and taken resources away, and suddenly information security isn't seen as a priority anymore? Or is it because actually suddenly it was elevated in status because of GDPR coming into force in 2018, and suddenly it's dropping off the radar again as time goes by? It's really interesting.
Really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I guess we can speculate in terms of, COVID, people working from home, priorities changing, budgets being squeezed. But brilliant stat to pick out. I mean, absolutely crazy. We've cited some of our references here. The government stats website is a really good one to take a closer look at when you have a moment. I know many of people watching this podcast will like to do their research as well. Another interesting stat I think is that a quarter of charities are experiencing some sort of breach or hack once a week. So this definitely hasn't decreased, and phishing attacks and impersonation continue to be some of the most common types.
Yeah, and they've been on the rise across the board, that type of attack since COVID. With that, you mentioned COVID and working from home and all that aspect, and I think maybe some people out there have realised that actually that makes targeting a little bit easier, because you haven't got that community aspect of people in the office saying, oh, this is weird, like I received this email, and instead people are dealing with it on their own more. Perhaps you haven't got that sanity check of having colleagues around you and things like that. Maybe that makes it easier to get in that way.
One of the things that we often try and support not-for-profits with is policies, right? And a BYOD, or bring your own device policy, is a standard one to have in the toolkit. Perhaps working from home, did people have the time during COVID to suddenly get a work laptop, or do you think they were using their own devices, tablets, phones more because they're just there were situations, weren't there, we experienced it the same, where all of a sudden people were just being told, right, from tomorrow you're working from home, and the time to put protocols in place was massively reduced.
Yeah, that's it, isn't it? Having that, I think for the charities that already and the other not-for-profits that already had that technical infrastructure in place, it's probably a much easier shift. But there's an awful lot out there that didn't have those mechanisms and technical constraints and policies and things in place to govern those types of aspects. So I think it's posed a really big challenge, and certainly I know there have been people working off their own machines and things like that within this sector. Whether or not they had things in place like VPNs and things to support that, I don't know.
Yeah, and as people do return to the office, maybe they're doing more hybrid working, or they're working from hub spaces. Are they always using secure Wi-Fi? Are people having to catch up on the train and using public Wi-Fi? So I think it definitely has increased the opportunity for opportunistic thieves to become more prevalent as well.
Definitely.
Should we come on to talk about the kind of challenges in this sector, Tanya? You and I have worked with these clients for some time. I used to work in the sector. It is unique, and there are going to be some specific challenges, right?
Yeah, definitely. And actually, I was sort of thinking about this, and we had to chat about it earlier. And I think for me, there's two particular things that I would say are very specific nuances to this sector. One of them is the use of volunteer groups. That's quite a specific nuance to this sector. Obviously, we don't find that in our corporate sector, for example, and it poses significant challenges for information security and for data privacy. And I know this is something that a lot of our clients have battled with, since pre-GDPR. How do you get that balance right between being able to use volunteers effectively, because they're necessary, to run those branches, maybe in different parts of the country, or particular support groups for particular groups of people who you're supporting. How do you support those volunteer groups being able to be effective while also retaining that oversight and control that you need to make sure that you're meeting your obligations under GDPR, and not introducing risk around information security? And I think it's a really hard thing to balance.
It is. I mean, volunteers are, often the lifeblood of a membership organisation. They're an extension of the staff team. They enable, special interest groups, they enable clubs, they run committees, they are part of the board often, they might be trustees, and, they're essential to the running of an organisation.
Yeah.
They often feel that they own the data. They see the groups as their members. They don't often have access to those central tools like CRMs or websites or learning management systems. They are often, downloading lists onto, again, personal devices, and it is a real minefield for, central service teams to put those policies and procedures in place to ensure, the compliance.
Yeah, and that's it, because they are not within the central office, and the central group. You don't necessarily know what they are doing. And I think a lot of these organisations sort of jump to lock them out of maybe central systems in some cases for GDPR. Another group in this sector kind of did the opposite and gave them access to a very controlled list, which in some respects to me makes a lot more sense, actually, because I think the problem is if you lock out that access completely, there's the danger that actually they go off and start developing their own lists even more outside of all central control and knowledge, and that starts becoming introducing a lot of risks, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think, if we think about the different types of data, I mean, across not-for-profit, we might have charities or those that are doing, individual giving or running lottery schemes. And so you've got different sets of data. You might have members, non-members, contacts, prospects. And, I know something that we know that our clients find quite challenging is to understand what the rights are of data subjects, what the processing, whether it's consent or legitimate interest, or, this is can be a minefield conversation sometimes, just because of the different pockets of data within an organisation too.
Yeah, and that actually kind of leads on to the other thing that I think is the second biggest challenge for this sector, and that is expertise. And I'm not talking about specific running of an NFP body or anything like that on the day-to-day. I mean, people in these sectors, especially the smaller organisations, are actually amazing. They're juggling multiple hats often, in one go, which is just great. But I think the expertise piece comes in for me, particularly around not just GDPR, and I think it's more around technology for me, because I think a lot of particularly the smaller clients within the NFP sector, they tend to rely on outsourced technology providers in terms of even their core IT, and that's quite difficult then, because I think a lot of assumptions are then made around what security measures have been put in place, firewalls, VPNs, mobile device management, and what policies are governing those. And I think that there isn't necessarily the knowledge within the organisation to be able to ask the right questions and sort of to check that the right things have been put in place for your particular organisation, because there isn't a one size fits all type approach. And even when it comes to things like backups and the ability to restore data, thinking about that principle of availability and things like that, and data accuracy, you. Asking those questions and making sure that the setup is right to meet your incident or event management, procedure is quite hard when you don't necessarily have that technical understanding in-house.
For sure, absolutely. I know we've both experienced people saying, well, why would we be a target? We're small, or what would hackers want from us? I think if you look at the types of sort of valuable data within these organizations, there's a lot of personal data, there's a lot of health information, often credit card details, or bank account details. We've worked with charities and not-for-profits before that have collected things like sexual orientation. I worked with an organization who was collecting trade union membership, special category data. So there's a lot. Yeah, there really is a lot of potential. I was just thinking, I can't remember ever working with a client who came to me straight away and said, our budget for GDPR is. Can you think of any clients that have come to us saying, we've got a budget in place for this already, or this is what we've already ring fenced, or this is on our top agenda every week, this is what we're doing about it?
I mean, I know we both work with one client who I know put a chunk of budget aside for GDPR to make sure that they transformed in the way that they needed to, alongside other transformations that they were doing at the same time, which was great to see. I think often the budget is quite squeezed and quite tight for this and hasn't really been thought about. And I think it comes back to that usual challenge, which isn't exclusive to this sector at all, but that buy-in from the top to GDPR, data privacy, information security being being a top priority, which when you think about what you just said, Janine, we're not going to be a target. Well, that's why, isn't it? Because I think there's a disbelief that if you're a small membership body or a small charity that you're gonna that anyone's ever going to target you. But that's just not the case. And it's also you really can't forget that the HFE Scotland example, where an inadvertent accidental breach could come from within and could still expose you to a massive fine.
Absolutely. And we know that these organisations are busy. People are often wearing multiple hats anyway, and then to get thrown the extra hat of you're now DPO or data champion or system owner, and so they're busy. They are dealing with different types of people to manage, like volunteers, as you've already mentioned. The vast majority of the ones we come into contact with are dealing with legacy IT infrastructure or systems, and they're being squeezed, right? So this is a difficult area to maneuver.
Yeah, I think it's really hard, and I think also sometimes some poor individual is given that role. You're going to be DPO, but not given any training with it. But there are obligations if you are naming somebody as your data protection officer. They have to be suitably trained and qualified and know what they're doing. That there is an obligation under GDPR for that. But I think that's sometimes forgotten, and this poor person, it may be their first or second job they've ever done, suddenly is responsible for data privacy across their whole organisation. And it's a bit of a challenge. And I think what you just mentioned, Janine, about the legacy systems is really significant, because there's a lot of that. There's also Excel all over the place. Again, I would say this sector, again, quite often it is fairly siloed. It depends on the size of the organisation, I think, but that can make it a massive challenge to understand what on earth is going on, enough to be able to start making the improvements that you need to make to stay safe.
That definitely happened to me. I started working at an organisation in 2008, and we were just putting in a new CRM at the time, and I became product owner in my first 2 weeks. And then in week 3, they said, do you also want to be DPO? And I just started a new job as head of membership. We were in the middle of a massive transformation. Then all of a sudden I was responsible for a lot of data, and so people started coming to me for asking for help. And I remember one colleague saying, so Janine, are you telling me I'm not allowed to mail to these people anymore? And I said, well, I'm not telling you yes or no, but I'm saying to you that you've got a whole heap of data here. We don't know where it came from. We don't know whether or not we have a lawful basis to process this data. It's really old, and I would advise that we don't use it. Absolutely. And there was some crosswords said.
Do you know what, you just reminded me, actually, because it's the same thing actually happened to me. I am also that poor person who had data protection officer and I think responsibility for freedom of information, because it was a public sector quango that I worked for at the time. So I suddenly came in as a 20-something-year-old was setting up various things for this organisation, a website and things, and suddenly got flung that on me as well. Wow! Oh, I've just had a flashback.
We've got the battle scars, which is why we got this.
Yeah, I buried it deep.
I think if we move on then to how secure is your organisation, and we're going to cover some of these areas where when we do this work with our clients, Tanya, I know we look in a bit more detail at some of these dimensions and others as well, but I think what we wanted to talk through today was just highlight a few of them and look at particularly what the challenges are for NFP. Should we start with your favourite policy?
So governance is one of my favourites. There's too many to choose from. So governance, this is an interesting one in this sector, because from what I've seen over the past few years, and even right up to the present, some organisations still have literally nothing in place to support data privacy and to meet their obligations under GDPR. Whereas some are typically, I guess, maybe the larger organisations tend to have a bit more in place around this. So it's about having those structures, that reporting back to board level that we sort of mentioned at the beginning, having change procedures in place, and then having that set of policies in place and procedures to support information security and data privacy across the organisation. But it's not just that, is it, Janine? It's also that hearts and mind piece. And I know we come on to culture in a minute, but are those policies and procedures really embedded into operational practice? Are they being followed, and have they been tested? And I think in many cases that I've seen, and I don't know if this is the same for you, Janine, but I don't think that's the case.
No, I completely agree. I was just thinking about an example client. We were looking at their policy last year, and I sort of innocently asked, where did this come from? Who created this policy? And they said, this person is quite experienced in this area, and they brought it with them from their previous organisation, and essentially what they'd done is scrub the name out of the top from the previous org and put the new org in. Of course, when we were reading through it, there was loads of stuff in there that was completely irrelevant, because it's a completely different sector, different type of organisation. It was citing roles and responsibilities that didn't even exist in the new org. And it had obviously been done, with good intentions, but you could tell exactly your point there. Who was reading it? Who was living and breathing this document? Nobody.
That happens so often as well. I've encountered that so many times. I can't even tell you how many. And it's actually not just in this sector either that I've found where actually you start doing, you typically do a bit of a documentary review as part of this process we work through. And that's one of the first things you do. Then you start having the interviews with people and looking at what's actually going on. And you realise actually this policy doesn't make any sense. It doesn't reflect reality. And actually that is such a dangerous thing to do. Particularly if it's your privacy policy, which we have encountered, which bears no relation to what you're actually doing. That's a document you're telling people, if you sign up for this on our website, this is what we're going to do with your data. If you're not doing that, or if then actually that is far worse than having nothing at all. And I think one of the most dangerous things I saw actually was a mobile device management policy, or bring your own device policy, that one of those. And in it basically was telling employees that the organisation in question had everything in place to make sure that personal mobile devices were secure. The organisation didn't have any of that technology in place. So actually that is far worse, because it was giving employees a false sense of security. So they weren't taking any additional steps to make sure that when they used their personal device, that the organisation's data was secure. So you can understand why I think the Information Commissioner's Office comes down far harder on organisations who have said they're doing something but aren't, because actually that's really dangerous and introduces additional risk.
I was just thinking that as you were talking, if you are in the position of succumbing to a phishing attack or a hack, or there's some internal kind of negligence, and the ICO do step through your front door, first thing they're going to ask for is, can I see your policies and procedures? And it's not going to take them very long to realise that they're inappropriate, or that they haven't been reviewed regularly, or that nobody seems to know where they are, what they mean, or how to follow them. So it's basics, right?
That's it. Yeah, and you just touched on the very end there. You just said, so the first question I ask is, was there a policy or a procedure in place? Second, did they follow it? So you cannot follow a procedure that isn't fit for your organisation. And if you've just taken a carbon copy from somebody somewhere else, which is very tempting to do, let's face it, there's tons of material out there. Let's just have a little Google and take someone else's. But you've got to make sure it's your own and is relevant. You have done that background work first.
Is the danger here, though, that staff just think, well, that's okay, because if there's a knock at the door, it's the DPO they're going to want to speak to first? People kind of just leaving it to that, does everyone need a DPO? Do they need to have a DPO in their organisation?
No, not everybody needs to have a DPO. It depends on the type of data you're processing, the size of your organisation and things like that. So sometimes you don't need a data protection officer per se. Common sense kind of tells us, and good practice tells us, that there should be somebody who is responsible for data privacy, even if it's not a technical data protection officer. Because, in this sector, typically there is a lot of, personal information being processed. Obviously, the risks are different if you're a membership organisation supporting B2B corporate sector as compared to say a charity organisation supporting individuals going through cancer, for example. So whether you need a DPO and the level of expertise and time and all that is going to take will be different in those types of organisations. So I think the other thing around governance we touched on earlier really is that we touched on these things. It's time. People are juggling many things, and it's that championing and that buy-in from the top to make sure that good practice is put into place, but also followed. And then we touched on. I was going to touch on assets, because we sort of almost went into that earlier actually, but it's interesting, isn't it, because you mentioned earlier that there's so many different sets of data within this sector, because obviously you are covering so many different types of organisations within the NFP sector. You've got that special category data, potentially you've got research and development data for some, and it's really important that a record of processing activity is kept, as well as understanding what your key assets that you want to protect are. And I think I would say many of the organisations that we go into don't have one or the other of those. I think there was a big drive when GDPR came into force to get that record of processing activity in place. Some organisations we have found recently still do not have one of those. I found that quite surprising. I think there is a tendency to forget that needs to be a living document. So your organisations, businesses don't sit still. Things change all the time. You go on to do new things. You implement new systems. You work with different third parties. So that needs to be reviewed whenever there's a major change, and just on a regular basis anyway. On say an annual basis, it should just be looked at just to double check is everything still the same. And I'd be surprised if it were, because nothing sits still. So I would question how many organisations are regularly reviewing that, and therefore whether it's still in date. But that artifact is absolutely key to being able to meet your subject access requests, for example, and your data breach requirements and things like that, because you need to know what you've got, where it is, how it's being handled, who has access to it, all of those types of things. So that's fundamental to that.
And while some organisations might be doing that in kind of a head or a central office, remember we're talking about organisations here that have got national and regional offices. They've got volunteers, they've got member groups, they've got committees, special interest groups. So there are processing activities going on both inside and on the fringes of the organisation, and they need to be captured too and kept up to date, as you're saying.
And then sort of specifically in relation to assets, and until you've identified what your crown jewels are, as we like to say, you don't necessarily know where the most important areas are to prioritise in terms of resources and security and things like that. So that's really important.
And if I call up and say to my membership organisation, I'm a member of several organisations. If I ring up and say I would like to make a subject access request, please, I'd like to see all of the data that you hold about me. And of course, we know they've got 1 month to do that, unless they can specify additional time required. But they've got to try and find that on a central system, and all those Excel spreadsheets that have been downloaded, all the volunteers that might have my information, and it goes on and on. So in order to meet that requirement of being able to do a subject access request, it goes back to assets and processing activity, and like all these things are joined up, right?
Yeah, exactly, they are, and you've got to be on the ball really to be able to meet that 30 days, particularly in that scenario you just described, where there's so much data kind of all over the place. That does make it a much bigger challenge, I think, for this particular sector. And I think we touched on this earlier, but another challenge really is culture and awareness. And I think there's quite big disparities in this sector between some organisations who are actually quite on the ball around data privacy, I would say, and information security, but some where, particularly the smaller ones, where that awareness is just completely lacking, and there just isn't the culture of just thinking through, what you're doing with the data. Do you need that data, or could you destroy it securely? All those types of things.
I mean, time and time again, when we're doing our maturity assessments, we ask people, what was the training like for information security or GDPR? And if we're lucky, the response we often get is, well, I watched a video when I first started. That tends to be for the newer people that maybe have started in the last, I'll be generous, 1 to 3 years, right?
Yeah.
People have been there for 20 years, and there's lots and lots of those people in membership organisations will say, yeah, I didn't have anything when I started. When GDPR came in, they made me watch a video. And then that's it. And you think, but there's loads of opportunities. All the membership organisations I've worked in had a regular Christmas party, a summer party. We had town hall stand-ups, we had intranets, we had newsletters. There's ample opportunity to be talking to your staff about this important subject and continuing to, make them aware, bring them up to date with the newest things that are coming in, the latest changes, the sophisticated types of attacks, and also the to make people aware of the negligence opportunities that we see happen a lot as well. So there's lots of opportunity, and I think it's untapped in this sector.
I agree. I think, and that drip feeding type approach that you just mentioned is a really good approach, actually. Small segments of information where it naturally fits, or where you can, rather than making people sit in one full day of training once a year or whatever. You don't need to do that. It's little bits here and there, and I think certainly quite a few of the organisations we work with, they had, as you said, when GDPR came in, a bit of training around data privacy. I would say that barely touched on information security in many cases, and I think there is, I know in some organisations there's a tendency for long-termers, as you mentioned, that the people who've sort of been there 20 years, but actually some in some roles within those organisations there is a higher amount of turnover, and I think quite often there isn't actually any kind of induction training in place for those new starters, so then that knowledge is lost. So there's a lot of opportunity there, as you said, and let's not forget that culture and awareness needs to come from the top, but it also needs to feed out to those volunteer groups. They need to be pulled into those training and awareness programs.
Yeah, really, really good point. And I think, with the prevalence now of hybrid and home working, again, this is an opportunity to review. I mean, I recall working in physical offices, and, in the print room, there were signs up on the wall, with things like, do you need to print this? And when you've printed it, has it got any data on it? And should you shred it? But if I'm not in the office, I'm not going to be seeing those posters, or like you said earlier, Tanya, talking to a colleague or asking advice, sitting next to somebody. So organisations have almost got to become more ingenious with finding new ways to reach out to their staff and their extended staff teams as well, like those people in nations, regions, and volunteers.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, and I think also that cultural aspect, some of that learning through seeing and absorbing what is inherently done within an organisation has been lost because of COVID and the move to remote working. That does mean more focus needs to be put on that induction piece, I think, in particular, and even pre-induction. Perhaps depending on on the organisation, just to really get that rhetoric and sort of mantra in people's heads that actually information security and data privacy are top of the agenda.
Yeah, and I think what you're actually touching on, one of the key principles of GDPR, privacy by design, right? This needs to permeate through an organisation. It needs to be just something that everybody does, not, consciously that someone gets, has to tell you off about at a regular interval.
Yeah, and actually that takes this kind of on to change management, doesn't it, a little bit, really, because I think this is another key area that organisations generally, not just this sector, fall over on. And I think for NFPs, depending on the size, they can be fairly siloed, and that does mean that oversight of change can be a bit neglected. I think it's really interesting, actually, this sector, because there is a massive divergence. That there's those organisations where actually I would say they're quite bureaucratic. And then there's quite strong, strict change control procedures in place. Then you get the other side of the scale, where actually things just happen arbitrarily as they need to happen, with kind of no oversight whatsoever. But I think it's getting a balance, and just making sure that change is managed in some way, so that before you make the change, that concept that you just mentioned, Janine, privacy by design, that the potential impact or the risk to personal data is considered up front, and also just the risk generally to information security for your information, for your organisation around information security are thought about up front, before the change is made and before something materialises. Because I think one of the things that we have seen in this sector a fair amount is that there's a bit of a tendency to make quite a lot of use of freely available online tools, you Google Docs, or and just other little tools, because of that issue with legacy systems and by use of Excel, sometimes the technology people need just isn't there, so they're trying to find things to make the job easier. Totally understand that. We all want to do that. I think the issue is that it's very easy to do that, and then suddenly, before you know it, a process has changed, something's being done differently, and actually it does have an impact on personal data or your security, and there's just no oversight of it at all. But it's getting a balance between being able to rapidly respond to the latest technology threats, so get that patch installed quickly, just making sure that small process changes and things like that are just checked, just to make sure they're not going to have an impact, versus those bigger change programs which maybe need a more complete review anyway. And I think really this is just good practice.
Absolutely. Yeah. Tanya, you mentioned third-party management earlier. I mean, to a certain extent, as soon as you are in a third party, some organisations think, well, that's the control taken out of my hands. But often organisations sort of don't realise that even if they're using a third party, they still have liability as the data controller. And there's a lot of third-party relationships in not-for-profits. You've got they nearly all have mailing houses. I've seen some organisations where some customer services roles are outsourced. Most of them have got a magazine publisher, they might have training providers or examiners, they might have somebody running like a lottery for them, or somebody else helping to manage maybe regular giving or individual giving. So there's a lot of third-party management, and even if an organization has got those third-party policies in place, I think what I've seen is the day-to-day management of those third parties, or the mindset, okay, well, that's somebody else's problem. And I think that is probably the biggest challenge to this sector.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've witnessed quite a lot is, okay, well, we're using this third party, half this sector use them, so they must be fine. Information security or data privacy requirements. It's that you could go ahead making that assumption, but the problem is that every organisation is unique, and it depends what you're doing and what type of data you're processing and how you're using that third party. So it's really important to make sure that you've done your own due diligence. And sometimes it's as simple as just checking, has that third party got appropriate accreditations? Are they ISO 27001 accredited, for example? Sometimes it might be a case of doing a little bit more due diligence, but I think there's a bit of a tendency to push third parties off to the legal team, get a nicely drawn out data processing agreement or whatever in place, but not actually ever check, is it being followed in any way? And I think often you find that people on the floor who are interacting with that third party on a regular basis, they haven't even seen the data processing agreement to know what they're meant to be doing and what the third party is meant to be doing. So I think there's a lot more control that could be put in place in that area. And, you know, quite often when there are data breaches, it does involve third parties, because I think inherently now most of us will use cloud service providers for a lot of our infrastructure. They're all third parties, and there are inherent risks in those, and it's just making sure that, you know, you've reduced your risk by just making sure that they are the appropriate supplier for you, that they're doing what you need them to do, and if there's anything particular in place that they need to have in place around exchange of data, for example, and encryption or anything like that, that you've communicated that to them. Because, you know, I've still seen organizations just sending Excel spreadsheets, you know, posting it into a Google Drive or just sending it by unencrypted email, for example, and it's full of, you know, POIE numbers and national insurance numbers and all the rest. So it's just making sure that you know, when you set out that data processing agreement, you are actually capturing those specific requirements and following them.
Yeah, I remember one place I worked in, we had to upload data to an FTP site, you know, on a monthly basis to get a magazine printed. And I thought, well, this is great because it's, you know, FTP, so they've obviously thought about the security. And I remember the first time I came along to upload the data, and I had a quick look, and every single data file that had ever been uploaded was still available from this FTP site. So the first thing I said was, well, what's all this in here for? You know, we should just be giving them data once a month, and then we should be ensuring, because we're the data controller, what are they doing with that information? And are they safely, securely deleting it after they've used it? Because they don't need it anymore. It's a one-time use. They're going to print some labels, they're going to pop the magazine in the bag, and they're going to send it out. So yeah, you know, even when, and this probably brings us on to talk about, you know, kind of digital security and network security, you know, even when all those things are in place, it's still the data management practices that are, and the culture that is often the bit that is letting you know, the side down.
Absolutely. And actually the that example that you just mentioned just made me think of when we think about how regularly we sort of change our providers these days as well. You know, we've seen sort of quite a lot of I guess this sector moving to new CRM systems and things like that over the last few years. How many times do these organizations go back to that third party provider and make sure that all the data that was in that legacy system that you're no longer using has been deleted completely from that system, from backups, from the rest? Because actually that's your obligation to do that under GDPR, but it's often something that gets forgotten. That's
a frightening thought. Let's move on to data management practices and digital security.
And I think again, you mentioned earlier, Janine, about the issue with legacy systems, and we talked a bit about, you know, the prevalent use of Excel. I think not just in this sector, but I think this sector is probably hampered sometimes by not having an awful lot of budget to invest in technology. So I would say that Excel usage is particularly prevalent here, and I think that rekeying between lots of internal systems and Excel and just things that aren't integrated, you know, I guess what you could say poor data management practices lead to increased risk around meeting your GDPR obligations and also around information security.
I was just thinking about the cupboards full of printed membership documents that I have encountered over my years, and just you know, it felt like sometimes every time I opened the cupboard, like data would fall out of it, and I just, you know, what we keeping this for? Well, you know, we might need it one day. And you know, retention policies and the, you know, the whole principle of data minimization, you know, again, they permeate throughout the whole of GDPR. And again, it's a mindset. It's privacy by design. It is, you know, a cultural, you know, stop and question. And I think for me, one of the ways, you know, I got my head around this when I was working in the sector was to think, how would I feel if this was my information? You know, in my blogs, I often talk about members as customers. You know, that is the type of service they expect when they come to an organisation. So if I was a member, I am a member of many organisations, but you know, if I was a member, a customer of my organisation, how would I expect my data to be treated? Would I like, you know, it to be lying loose in a cupboard somewhere ready for someone to open it and for it to all and we've all seen, you know, we had those you know, those stats up on screen earlier. We've all seen, those horrible newspaper articles about bags of data being left by bins or on the train, or that kind of thing. This is happening. It's happening to organizations. It's still happening now.
And it's a big PR issue, isn't it, really, particularly for charities who are reliant on goodwill and donations to make sure that they are keeping things securely. But that point that you just mentioned, Janine, about putting yourself in the data subject's shoes, I think is absolutely key. And I always tell clients that goes from the data management practice right through to the policies and your signposting on your website, for example, your employees and everything, because one of the key principles of GDPR is about transparency and fairness. And I think unless you're being really careful about what you're doing with people's data and really clearly explaining what you're doing with them, you're not really following those principles. So it is just thinking through, if I were coming to make a donation to this charity, what would I want to know? How would I expect my data to be handled? What do I want you to tell me so that I feel comfortable making this donation and I actually have free choice?
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen this balancing act between customer experience and operational need, and often we've mentioned it time and time again. Even the ones that have got new CRMs are probably still battling with some other legacy system. Might be their finance system, might be their website, might be their intranet, or their telephony system. They're often ones that get forgotten about or left behind. But from our own work, we have seen some good levels of technical security measures applied across the sector, but we've also seen some pretty broken processes as well. So I think digital security is probably a mixed bag in this sector, and probably has been challenged by the impact of remote working too.
And I think it does. For me, it absolutely comes back to the point that we talked about in the beginning, that a lot of the smaller organisations are working with these, with a third party outsourced IT provider who is potentially providing their network, their systems, and maybe even some of their applications. And I think that assumption around they're managing it, and it's fine, they provide support for other organisations, so I'm sure that's adequate. Well, that lack of expertise around technology that sometimes exists internally makes it very, very difficult then to challenge and ask the right questions of that third party, to make sure that the right things are in place for that individual organisation. I think that's a key issue for me. So I think sometimes, you go into, for example, a charity organisation, the smaller ones, and you sort of start asking questions about, their network security, and they just cannot. Nobody can give you an answer because they just don't know. And you can understand that. There's nobody there with a technical IT background. It's complicated to discuss. So I feel that's a big problem, actually. It's that lack of awareness and the lack of, I guess, due diligence steps. What do we need, and what have we got in place, and is it adequate to meet our level of risk and the scenarios that may occur to us?
I think moving on from digital security, I mean, physical security is a challenge for these organisations. Many membership orgs have a central office. They might have regional offices as well. Charities will often have satellite and central offices. A lot of the big membership orgs, especially the charter bodies, still have member hub space on site. They might have event departments where they are hiring out rooms. Coming from a membership background, we still had every year some members who wanted to physically come to the office to pay their membership subscription, because it was the one time of the year where they got to visit their body and their organisation. That's very much how they felt of it. So there were occasions where someone would come in with a fistful of cash or a cheque, and we'd have to bring them up to the office, and they'd have to stand there, in the room with everybody processing information whilst we took their cash from them and got them a receipt or popped their details through something. During COVID, some organisations probably were in full lockdown at some point, but as they started to open up and then we had less staff on site, my worry is there were less people there to challenge suspicious activity. What was stopping someone just turning up and getting access to a room? And Tanya, you're like a ninja. I know you do this when you go to orgs. You try and get into rooms that you're not supposed to. We try to, can we access the server room or the membership office? We do it on purpose, don't we?
Oh yeah. It's actually very easy. easy, not just this sector, I have to say, any sector, it's actually very easy to get in. And the old, oh, can you help me? I'm carrying all these cups of coffee for my work colleague is a great way of getting access to most buildings.
And how many times has someone said to you, who are you? Or are you supposed to be here?
Well, and this is it, isn't it? Because actually, never, but but I think this will be worse post-COVID because of that issue where we've only seen people via video conferencing. You know, the people on the door haven't, and just people generally in the office haven't seen that, you know, those regular faces day to day. So the sort of stop and challenge somebody who doesn't look familiar suddenly becomes stop and challenge everything, which in reality probably isn't going to happen, is it? So yeah, it's a bit of a challenge. And I think the other thing is with remote working, it's you mentioned earlier, Janine, the public Wi-Fi. You know, do you have a VPN or anything like that to protect yourselves? Have you told staff what they should and shouldn't do in that scenario? What about clear desk policies and you know, locking up your laptop and things like that, and any notes and things like that when you're working from home? You know, and again, that volunteer piece is quite interesting here, isn't it? Again, because you've got potentially people working from their home and collating lists of, you know, members and or donors or whoever, potentially printed out and dashed in a drawer. I mean, you just don't know, do you? But it's having those policies and that training and awareness piece again, isn't it, around that?
Tanya, I'm conscious of the fact that we've mentioned sort of several like key terms today. So I know we've popped them all in a kind of slide here, and we'll make this available on the usual channels. But you know, I think, you know, there's some obvious ones around GDPR in here, but you know, there's some other exciting ones like phishing and spoofing and malware and hacking and that kind of thing. So yeah, I think a takeaway would be, you know, have a look at this and talk to your teams, your people about it.
Yeah, and I think a key thing, we know that phishing and spear phishing have increased post COVID. So I think, you know, both those terms are on here, which is great. But I think no one is immune to that, and your people are your first line of defence. You know, technology can only do so much for you in these kinds of scenarios. We have seen examples where clients have almost lost money. You know, the full works with spear phishing in particular.
Yeah.
And it's actually quite scary when you see the chains of emails and correspondence that have happened to get to the point where someone's about to give money. They're really, really convincing. So educating your staff on the sniff test, you know, does it look right, feel right, smell right? Are there any red flags? You know, does the domain look right? Are the weird caps everywhere? Is the spelling a bit off? You know, all those things. Would I expect this supplier to be asking me for this money? You know, those types of things, you know, are really important just to get your staff aware of. And actually, going on to the physical security side, one of the things that also has quite a lot of success when we come in and do social engineering is typically stick a poster on a wall, put a load of free sweets underneath. If you scan this QR code, you're going to get, I don't know, some prize or something. And the number of credentials that we get is usually quite amazing. People share an awful lot when they think they're going to be getting something free. So,
amazing.
So just thinking through all of those and just educating your staff and just making them think, it's that thought process that needs to be there, that awareness piece.
Yeah, I mean, we're great advocates, aren't we, of, you know, don't wait till it happens, do some mock, you know, put some mock incidents on, you know, make it fun, you know, send around the dodgy email and see whether or not you get people reacting to it.
Yeah, that testing piece is absolutely key, because that's going to actually tell you the reality. Are you an organisation who just has a policy sitting on a shelf, or are you an organisation who has properly, truly embedded your good information security and data privacy practice into operational, you know, day-to-day practice? And those social engineering tests will help you to understand that, and then help you to continually improve. It's really important.
Excellent. So I think, you know, in summary, you know, don't wait till it happens. Do some mock testing. Talk to your people. Dust off those dusty policies that have been sitting on the shelf for some time, and go back through and test them. Tanya, any last thoughts or advice for people? What should they do next?
I would do exactly what we've just said next, to be honest. What you've just advocated, Janine. I think the key is testing. Just audit what have you got in place. How mature is your information security setup? How mature is your data privacy regime? Test it. validate it, and just make changes as appropriate. But just remember, organisations evolve all the time, so your processes, practices, policies, procedures, structures need to evolve as well.
Fab. Thank you very much for listening.
Cheers.